Hi, good morning everyone. Welcome to another SmithOS 101 live learning session. Today, we're going to show you how to set up an API endpoint component, okay? We're also going to show you how to create custom outputs based on the data input that you'll receive, and also, share some helpful tips on how you can master this component, okay? So I'm just going to use the same agent from last time. So it's already open in another tab here. So remember last time, if you've watched the previews SmithOS 101 session that we had, I've shown everyone how to create, do basic chaining like this and create a simple, very simple agent, okay? So you can always watch that session on our YouTube channel, okay? So, alright, so what is an API endpoint? Alright, what is this component? So, your API endpoint component represents any specific functionality within your workflow, alright? It helps the agent trigger the correct functionality to perform a specific task or task related to that functionality. Alright, so an agent can have a single endpoint or workflow like this one, or it could have multiple API endpoints. Alright, doing more than just, for instance, writing haiku. Alright, let's say it also writes emails, social media posts, and many more. So you can have multiple API endpoints. So, okay, so aside from, showing your agent or telling your agent what a specific function to trigger, alright, in your workflow, the API endpoints also makes it possible, and this is super important. It makes it possible for other applications to interact with your agent, to interact or connect with your agent. Okay, so, alright, let's go over the API endpoint configuration. So, go to your base sidebar. Alright, you'll find the API endpoint here. Not to be confused with the call API component. Alright, so just drag. Alright, this is your API endpoint component, and this is your call API component. Okay, so they might look the same, they might sound the same because of the name, but they are different, okay, obviously. So while the API endpoint component here allows external applications or users to interact with your agent or connect with it, the API call component, on the other hand, lets your agent interact with external sources via API call requests. So that's the main difference there, okay? We're gonna discuss more about the API call component in a future live learning session, okay? But for now, let's just focus on the API endpoint component. Okay, so to enable the sidebar, just hover your mouse, alright, over your component here, and then click this cog or gear icon. Okay, you'll know that your component is highlighted if you see this dark what do you call it, border, alright, around it. So, okay, so now we have the configuration sidebar open for the API, for this API endpoint component. Let's start from the top. Okay, so method. You need to specify a method for your API endpoint for the HTTP request. All right. So you can select post or get. All right. So what's the difference? So first, the post method is used for sending new or when you are updating data in an existing, let's say, database or server. Alright? It's basically used if you're manipulating data. Alright? So it is secure and it also supports large data payloads. Okay? Now, the other one is the get method. So you use the get method if you're just fetching data without changing it, without tweaking it from any server. Okay? So, let's try the get method for now. Alright, let's go over it real quick. So, let's say I want this endpoint to fetch a specific or a list of topics based on the description that I will provide. Alright, so I'm gonna name this endpoint. So when you're naming endpoints, just a tip, alright, you need to make sure that it is clear and descriptive. Alright, that it reflects the purpose of your API endpoint. Okay, so let's say I'm gonna name this endpoint get topics. Alright, now there's an option here. By default, this is enabled, which is called expose to AI. So yeah, so what it does is that it makes the API endpoint available to SmithOS and other agent embodiments platforms like ChatGPT, like the chat embodiment. Alright, so if this is disabled, once you deploy your agent, they won't be able to see it. So they won't be able to call on this API endpoint. Alright, even though the instruction is very specific to this endpoint, if this is not enabled, they won't be able to see this. Alright, so let's just leave this as is, because again, as I've said, by default this is enabled. So let's just leave this as is. Okay, now we have the instructions here. So this is important to make sure that the AI agent, this is for the AI agent, to understand what this endpoint is all about. Okay, so you need to make sure that you provide a very detailed description of what the endpoint is all about. Alright, this is super important if you have multiple endpoints. Alright, this helps the AI agent identify the correct endpoint to call when you are giving it instruction. Alright, so it won't be helpful if you have API endpoints with the same instruction. It won't make sense to the agent. So make sure that each API endpoint has its unique endpoint name, and it has a very descriptive instruction of what it does. Alright, so for this example, this is a very straightforward API endpoint. So I'm just gonna write the instruction like this. It gets topics from based on description. Alright, now next is description here. So this one is for documentation purposes. So this one needs to have you know, the specific details of the API endpoint, right? The like the expected inputs, expected outputs. All right, what is its core functionality, what it does. All right, so you need to have it added here, again, for documentation purposes. So for now, we can just leave this as is. All right, like blank. So I'm gonna save my configuration here. Don't forget to save your configuration, okay? All right, now I have a my API endpoint here. If I want to add an input variable or parameter, I'm just going to click this plus icon here, then set a name. So let's say I'm going to add here, okay, description. Because as I've said, I want to use this data to fetch specific topics, okay? So description. Now I need to set up my data type. So what's the data type that I'll accept, or this endpoint will accept, all right, for this input parameter? So when you click this drop down arrow, you'll have here a list, all right? So the first one is any. So this type accepts, again, any form of data without restriction. So if you want this input parameter to accept any form of data, whether it's a string, a number, boolean, an array object, an array, then a JSON object or JSON array, then yeah, you can just set this one to any. All right, so by default it is set to any. Then yeah, if you want to restrict the data type for this input parameter, you can select from the list here. Again, you have different options, all right? So yeah, you can select any of this here. You can select binary if you want this input parameter to accept files, external files, or if you want if you want users or external applications to be able to upload files via this endpoint. So let me just show you how it looks like. Like for instance, I've set this to binary type. I'm gonna save it. If I click debug, this is how it's gonna look like. So it will enable you to choose a file and upload it, all right, for processing. Now, okay, going back. So for this one, I could select string or any, but for this demo, I'm just gonna select any, okay, as data type. So this input parameter accepts any form of data, okay, except for binary, because binary needs to be is only specific to uploading files, all right, except for binary. Then we have here this checkbox here to make this API this input parameter optional, okay? So you can check this box. Like if you have, let's say you have multiple input parameter and not all of them are required, like, you know, it is required if the agent or if the endpoint won't be able to execute the task if it misses that data input. All right, that's required. Now, if your agent could execute whether or not a particular data input is there or not, then you can set that data input into optional. All right, but since we only have one input parameter here, I'm not gonna set it to optional, okay? Now, there is a box here for default value. So this is helpful if, for instance, your API endpoint is, you know, if the data for your API endpoint is coming from another endpoint within your workflow. Let's say it is automatic, or let's say this API endpoint is being used on another agent, all right, or external application. It's good to set up a default value, so in case the input value is not supplied, but the API endpoint has been called, it would still run. It would not stall. Again, for automation, if this API endpoint's data input is being supplied by another component, by another endpoint, or, you know, within the workflow, or another endpoint within another agent and you don't want to stall the process. Let's say this particular API endpoint is part of a process. All right. You can add a default value to make sure that it won't stall. All right. In case the input, input name here or input data has not been supplied. All right. So you can set a default value. So regardless whether the input name is blank or not, the process won't stall. It will continue, all right, to the end. So I'm not gonna set up any default value for now. Then next is description. Okay, so this is optional, but it is important as well if you want to emphasize to the agent or to clarify what the role of this input parameter is. All right, so this is helpful again for complex systems. All right, so if you want to specify, like for instance, this input parameter only accepts array, you can add a description here letting the agent know that this input parameter only accepts array, let's say in a specific format. Okay, so it reinforces the role of this input parameter, okay, to the agent. So that's what it does. Okay, so for now, I'm just gonna leave all the optional fields blank and unchecked. So I'm gonna save this. Alright, now I have an input parameter. Okay, I could start running this API endpoint. Okay, let's say related to plants. So this is my description. Okay, so since we're using the get method, these data will go to query here. Alright, as you can see, I have here the data. Alright, now if I only want the string value, alright, the input value as it is, not in an array or not in a JSON object like this, I can set up a custom output. Let's copy this. Alright, I'm gonna add a note here and just drop it for reference. So this is the example. Alright, now I'm gonna set up a custom output. Now I'm gonna click this plus icon right beside request ports label here. Okay, now since the data is being passed to the query here, the format of the expression should be query dot, then I'm gonna get the value from this key property. So I'm gonna add here description. Okay, so now if I'm gonna run the same example, I still have it in query, but if I want the value, only the value, if I go to this custom output, I have the value, right, in string. So that's how you do it. Now, if you want a cleaner custom output labeling here, you can use advanced. What you have to do, I've shown this in my previous demo tutorial. You can cut and paste it here and then just add any label here. So let's say I just want to set this to description. Okay, so it will do the same thing as long as you have the expression here. All right, it will still extract the value from the key property description. All right, as long as you have the expression here. But yeah, let me just demonstrate. I'm gonna debug. So as you can see, it's still here. There, right? So you can do it that way. Okay, now what we want to do next is to, let's say, connect this to an, let's say a list. Okay, so I'm just going to use the, um, I'm just going to use the LLM prompt component and then set it to echo. Okay, then in my prompt, I'm going to add here a list of titles. All right, these are just example. So examples I have here 10. Okay, so I'm gonna save this. But yeah, we're using an echo model here, not any LLM model. So this LLM prompt component will just reflect the exact data that I have in my prompt. Now let's rename this LLM prompt component to list of titles. Okay, now I'm gonna use another LLM prompt component to generate the response. This time I'm gonna set the model to GPT-4, yeah, turbo latest. Okay, make sure to set the maximum output token. I'm gonna set this one to 6.4. Okay, now I'm gonna rename this to response. And alright, and then I'm gonna add my input parameters. I'm gonna add an input parameter for description. Then I'm gonna rename the default input to list. Okay. Alright, now let's go back to the configuration. Now in my prompt, I'm gonna ask it to select, okay, select the title or titles, it could be more than one, from the list, okay, that matches the description, like closely match or matches the description. All right. Okay, and then I'm gonna add the variables here. So list is equal to the list variable. Alright, and then the description to description. Okay, so this will be later, of course, replaced by the actual data from the input parameters that will be passed to the input parameters. Okay. Okay, now I will add another instruction, alright, to my prompt, asking it to generate the output in JSON with no extra text. Okay, and then I'm gonna add here a sample format. Like this. Okay, so now I have here a JSON object example. Okay, now we just need to connect this. Let's chain this together. First, I'm gonna replace the input name for the list of titles to trigger, because we're just gonna trigger it. Okay, again, we're not gonna do any text generation here for this particular LLM prompt model. We're using Echo. We're just gonna trigger it and then pass the exact data that we have in the prompt to the next component. So I'm gonna trigger it with the description. So every time this API endpoint receives input data, it's gonna trigger that LLM prompt. Then we're gonna connect the description to the other LLM prompt for context. Okay, same for the list of titles. So, okay. Now, this is how we're going to pass the data from the API endpoint to the succeeding components. Okay. So now let's run debug and see how this all is going to work. Okay, we have here the input data, anything related to plants. Okay, so you can see this component here is in orange because it's waiting for the other data. Okay, now it's green. As you can see, it means we have now all the data that we need. So we have the list here for context, and then we have the description. All right, now let's try to run. Okay, so now you have the response here. As you can see now. Okay, awesome. So you now have the titles, right, that it got from this. So number one. So we needed, the topics that are related to plant. So it provided us with number one, the secret life of urban trees. And then the other one is the number three in your list, which is plant intelligence here, right? So yeah, this is very simple. All right. But yeah, now you have an endpoint that, gets data, right, from simple database. So we turn this LLM prompt into a simple database. Later on, later into our, future session, we will make use of the um, data lookup to replace this, all right? So that's how you use the get and method. All right, so as you can see, there are no data manipulation here. We didn't try to change anything from this list, right? We just basically get the data as is. All right, there is a more straightforward again option to do this using the data lookup. We will tackle that later, all right, into our future live sessions. All right. Now that's get method. Now let's move on to the post method. All right. So again, we use post if we want, if the process requires data manipulation. Okay, we're gonna tweak the data, we're gonna update, we're gonna add, we're gonna delete. All right. So this one, let's say I wanna process or upload contacts into a database. All right. So I'm just gonna upload. Let's say I just wanna upload names. Alright. Right. Then I'm gonna save this. I'm gonna add. Now, let's say for this one, I'm dealing with huge, let's say a list of names. Alright. For this one, let's say the list is in an array format. Alright. So I'm just gonna name this as, okay, JSON array. Alright. And then I'm gonna set the type to array. So I want this input parameter to accept only data in array format. Okay. So I'm gonna save this. Okay. So this is what the data looks like. I'm gonna add it here. Okay. Let's do debug. I'm gonna enter the array here. Okay. As you can see, it gets routed to the body because we're using the post method. So the data becomes an array of the JSON array field here. Alright. Now, let's say I only want to get the names. Okay, just the names like John Doe, Gene Smith, Sam Johnson, and I don't need the other data here. Alright, for post-processing purposes, I don't need the email and phone number. I just need the names. What do we need to do? So again, okay, let me just copy this for reference. Okay, so this is the raw input. Alright, so this is how you make your agent. It's really helpful. Like if you have your raw data, the data that you use to test, added here in a note. Same goes for this one. So these are really helpful. Okay, I'm gonna say this is the output. Okay, so I have here my raw input and then the output. Alright, because I need this later to create the custom. I'm gonna put it here side by side. Okay, I need this to create my custom output. Okay, let's say I only need the names. Or for instance, I only need the names from the first JSON object within this array. Alright. So now what I'm gonna do, let me do it like this. So when I click, okay, we're gonna create a custom output that specifically extracts the name John Doe. Alright, from this again array. So first, we're gonna type body. All right, because we're extracting it from the body. And then I'm gonna, yeah, we already have one here. So JSON array, we're gonna extract it from the body containing the JSON array key property. All right, and now we're gonna add this square brackets here. Now, since we're only getting or extracting the name value from the first array object here, we're gonna set the array value to 0. All right. Now I'm gonna click. I'm gonna add another dot here, and then I'm gonna add name. All right, because we're only extracting the value of the name. So what happens here, so the data input that's being passed to the body, all right, is a JSON array, all right, object with nested, or this is the JSON object with a nested array containing 1, 2, 3, 3 objects. All right, so we're getting the value of the name from the first object. So it always starts with 0, not 1. If you set this to 1, we'll be getting Jane Smith instead of John Doe. So it always starts with 0. Okay, so I'm gonna save this expression. Okay, and then I'm gonna run this. So it's the same raw input. Okay, so we have it in the body, and now we have John Doe extracted from this list. All right, so custom output, so it's pretty much the same with everything else, with an LLM prompt and any other component, all right, that allows you to extract values from an array, all right, or from a JSON file. So you need to create JSON expressions like this. You need to make sure that you are extracting the data from the correct default outputs here, output parameters here, all right, output variables. So if you set this to query instead of body and you're using post method, it's not gonna work. All right. So let's say I wanna get all the names. I wanna get all the names from this JSON array. Okay, so I'm just gonna copy this. Then I'm gonna create another expression, another custom output. Then I'm gonna set this to 1. And then I'm gonna set this to 2. All right. Now if I'm gonna run this, now I'm extracting the specific values from each JSON object within this array. All right. So that's what we're doing now. Okay, so let's say I want to extract everything. So I'm just gonna do another one. And then instead of name, okay, let me just zoom that. Okay, so we can see this. Okay. So instead of name, I'm gonna replace this one with email. So I'm also extracting the email value for this JSON object. Okay, so I'm gonna save this, and then I'm gonna do the same for the rest. Let me just copy this one. Oh, it's okay. Okay, let me just add, then replace this with 1. than 2. Alright, so now we're extracting the email for all other, for the rest of the JSON objects in this array. Now we're gonna get the phone number. So I'm gonna, so, you know, by the way, this is case sensitive, so you need to make sure that you are, you know, if the key property is spelled this way with one of the letters in capital, you need to make sure that you write it as is or you copy it as is. Oops, no. I'm gonna add another one. So this is number 1. And this is number 2. So now, if I'm gonna run debug, it's not. Alright, so we're now capturing everything one by one. Alright, now, let's say, yeah, so now, since I'm capturing everything one by one, I can now, you know, it depends on how you want to process this information. Maybe the first one you want to upload it into a database. Maybe the other two you want to send emails to them and use the, and use the names and the other data you have specifically to, you know, curate or create your email. So it depends. You need custom outputs if, you know, you need to process each string data within an array separately, or you want to do batch uploads, or you want to convert them into a different JSON file, or if they're gonna be a part of a different file, alright, of a different process. So you need custom outputs for that. Alright. So okay, so yeah, so that's your API endpoint. Alright, that's how you do it. That's how you set it up. Both get and post. Okay. What else? Okay, there's another question that I received recently about API endpoint. When is the best? When is it proper to add another API endpoint? So, well, the rule of thumb or my tip for this one is that if your API endpoint, if the API endpoint requires a different set of input parameters, right? Just create a separate API endpoint for that one. So, for instance, this API endpoint is for creating contacts, right? So, the purpose of the API endpoint is for creating contacts. It has a different input parameter, right? I'll just create a separate one for it. I won't merge it with any of this API endpoint because they have different purposes. Like this endpoint here is for writing haiku, right? It requires a different input data to run this API endpoint. Same goes for this endpoint here, which I use to get or fetch a specific, you know, information from a list, from a data storage. So the rule of thumb is if you have a function that you want to add and it is different, all right, it performs a totally different function, right? You need to add a separate API endpoint for it. If it uses a different set of input parameters, yeah, use a separate API endpoint for it. You don't want to get everything added into a single API endpoint, you know, and then later on, it will add complexity because you now have to add multiple, maybe not just one, but multiple classifiers just to handle those different scenarios, because one input parameter is one scenario, can lead to a different scenario, can lead to a different case. So you don't want to handle all those things in a single API endpoint. All right, it would be really, yeah, complicated. It's not clean, and it goes against simplicity. It's not gonna be optimized. It would be really difficult to optimize. So, and yeah, we're at time. I hope you find this lesson helpful. If you have any questions or you want us to go or dig deeper into API endpoint, let me know. We can set up another live session for it. Okay? Have a great day, everyone.